Despite the rising tensions, anyone glancing at both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships that year would have been impressed by McLaren's season by the time the Hungarian Grand Prix came around in August. We were looking good as a team, topping both tables with a healthy lead over Ferrari. And as I wasn't directly assigned to either of our two drivers that year, this position is what pleased me most of all. Hello and welcome back to another Tales from the Treehouse. You may well have guessed already that today I'm talking about that fateful afternoon in Hungary during qualifying in 2007 when things went embarrassingly wrong for McLaren. That was the year, of course, if you don't remember, that we had this really strange qualifying situation where you would qualify on a Saturday with your race fuel in the car. And it created this crazy situation where we would have to go out in Q3 in qualifying, having fueled the car up, declared our fuel level to the FIA, and then spend most of the session just going round and round and round, trying to burn off as much of that fuel as possible to make the car as light and as fast as possible when it mattered at the end of the session. The FIA would then essentially pay us back with the fuel for the number of laps that we were able to do in qualifying, so that we could refuel the car to the correct level, ready for the first stint of our race on a Sunday. Doesn't sound like much, but one extra lap could open up a strategic advantage when it comes to your race strategy on a Sunday afternoon. So if you could manage at some circuits to get one more lap than everybody else in your fuel burning phase, that was a potential advantage. Now at the Hungaroring, that was possible. To make the situation fair, at McLaren we had a very clear and open system that we would alternate between our two drivers as to who was able to go out first on a Saturday afternoon, queue at the end of the pit lane and get the opportunity with a clear track in front of them at the start of Q3 to potentially go for that extra lap. In Hungary in that particular year, it was Fernando's turn to go out first. Having safely sailed through to Q3 in dominant fashion, Lewis, controversially aided by his race engineers and mechanics, broke from the agreed plan and left the garage first to queue up at the end of the pit lane ahead of the final session of qualifying. Fernando's team was angry and confused, but there wasn't time to discuss what was happening. Instead, they followed suit and lined up behind him at the end of the pit lane, waiting for the green light to start the session. Now, in the garage at that point, the radios were going crazy. I was overseeing both sides of our garage that particular year, so I was one of the few people that had two radio packs, access to both radio channels from both drivers and their teams, and I can assure you it was crazy in my headset at that moment. Fernando's team screaming on the radio, what on earth is going on? Looking over to the other side of the garage where Lewis's engineers would look back and shrug their shoulders as if to say, I don't know what's going on. Clearly there was some collaboration between Lewis and his engineers to be able to send the car out early, but this was definitely not the plan, and it had definitely caused a massive amount of controversy even at that stage in the early part of qualifying. Some people assumed it was just a mistake and that Lewis would move over, allowing Fernando past as they got going, but confusion turned to frustration as the lights went green and Lewis sped off into the distance. He'd gone rogue. He really had gone rogue. His radio fell absolutely silent, despite the engineers and the team management coming onto the radio saying, Lewis, you need to let Fernando pass. This is not the plan. Nothing came back from radio on the radio channel on Lewis's side. He literally fell silent. Of course, on Fernando's side, he was screaming, he was shouting, he was swearing. The engineers were questioning, as Fernando was questioning. The team management were having to step in. Even Ron Dennis stepped in at one point, which is hugely unusual and reserved for only the most extraordinary situations. And still, Lewis ignored all of the requests to let Fernando by and get back onto the agreed plan. Now during Q3, we always planned to go out and do as much fuel burning laps as we could. We'd then come in for a fresh set of tyres and go for a fast lap to get a banker lap in. You'd then come back in for a second pit stop, more fresh tyres when the car was at its lightest, the circuit at its fastest, and go for that ultimate shot at pole position. I was part of the right rear wheel crew in pit stops at that time. Fernando's car approached and stopped accurately on the marks. The wheel guns fired, wheels came off, new ones went on, the guns fired again, and our job was done. It had been controlled and slick. Perfect, in fact. Now, the other thing that we often used to do that was perfectly normal was we would hold the drivers in the pit stop box at that part of qualifying, waiting for a gap to emerge on the racetrack and then feed them back in to give them the best shot at the fastest lap time. On that particular day, we already had told Fernando we needed to hold him for 20 seconds to be able to feed him back into that particular gap. I knelt a foot from the stationary car, the engine loud, the sound of it rumbling through my bones. Heat emanated from the burning brakes and exhausts, cooking me through my fire suit. I was waiting. The radio in my ear began counting down. 10, 9, 8. The count was going directly into Fernando's ear too. 7, 6, 5, 4. Lewis had arrived behind us, queuing for his pit stop as we knew he would, his engine growling. 3, 2, 1. The chief mechanic lifted the lollipop, releasing Fernando's car for his final run. But nothing happened. It was one of the most bizarre moments that I've certainly ever experienced in terms of pit stops. The driver sitting stationary despite the lollipop being lifted and him being free to go and get back onto the racetrack. The engineers shouted on the radio to say, "Fernando, you've got to go. We're going to run out of time if you don't go soon." There was a procedure on that outlap to warm up the tyres that had to be followed to get your tyres into the best condition possible, which took longer than a normal flying lap would. That had all been calculated to precision. So now we're screaming at Fernando saying, "You've got to go, you've got to get out of here. Come on." As mechanics, we're all looking at each other going, what's going on? Nobody had a clue. I remember standing up, waving at Fernando, saying, "Come on, go, get out of here." Others were doing exactly the same. Lewis, who'd arrived and he was queuing behind Fernando, started revving his engine like an angry boy racer at the traffic lights. He was shouting on his radio saying, "What's going on? Come on, we've got to get on with this." There was utter confusion absolutely everywhere. Only after about 4 or 5 seconds did I realise that Fernando was doing this deliberately. He waited and waited. More seconds ticked away. We could do nothing but wait and frantically wave at him to go. Eventually, a full 10 seconds after the lollipop had been lifted, Fernando screeched away. Now, of course, Lewis is screaming, he's shouting on the radio. He pulls immediately into our pit stop box. So we had no time to question it, no time to talk about it, to wonder what had happened. We had to immediately get on with changing the tyres on Lewis's car, which of course we did. And he then wheel span himself away and got back onto the racetrack as quick as possible. But the problem was now, he was really up against a significant time pressure to get around that outlap before the checkered flag came down to end the session. One radio channel fell silent, the other, Lewis's, was busy, shouting, arguing, questioning. The engineers had to try and calm him down to focus him on getting around the lap as quickly as possible before the checkered flag had dropped. Once that happened, Q3 was over and the shot at pole position would surely be gone. There was literally no time for any of the tyre warming, the brake warming, the carefully controlled procedures that we always did on an outlap. It was just desperation to get Lewis around to the end of the lap. Lewis was down. He was saying, "I can't do this. This is over. This is over. There's no way I'm going to make it." His engineers were saying, "Lewis, you've got to get your head down and focus. We can still do this." The engineers were wrong. Lewis didn't make it. Fernando crossed the line to start his flying lap with just 1 second to spare before the checkered flag came out. Lewis was 2.5 seconds behind him. It was so close. And on one hand, whilst I was disgusted that particular day with both of my drivers, because both of them had let themselves down, but more importantly than that, they'd both let the team down. Lewis, by starting the whole process, by going rogue away from the team plan that had been agreed literally a few hours earlier. And then Fernando, in his response, which was certainly the most public of the responses, and therefore he got the brunt of the public blame for it. But both of them had played their role in this. And whilst I had lost a huge amount of respect for both of them in those moments, I couldn't help but be strangely impressed with the accuracy that Fernando had managed to sit in the cockpit with all of this going on and calculate to within a second the time he needed to get round to finish his lap, but therefore prevent Lewis from being able to start his. It was an unbelievably clever, calculated hugely mischievous and ultimately very, very disappointing act from Fernando, started, as I say, by Lewis. Both drivers lost a huge amount of respect that day from the team, and actually it took a long time for anyone within that team to gain that respect back for both of the drivers. Of course, the season went on to be an utter disaster for a number of different reasons in 2007, but you can very clearly trace a lot of it back. The fact that we didn't win the title that year, the fact that Lewis ended up in that gravel trap in China having stayed on a set of tyres for way longer than he should have done, that was all because the engineers on his side of the garage were so focused on trying to beat Fernando because of this internal rivalry that had built up, more so than looking at the bigger picture, when all they really had to do was focus on the championship. Because they didn't do that, they stayed out way too long on the tyre, Lewis ended up in the gravel trap, and ultimately the rest is history. We lost the championship that season for that very reason, or at least partly for that very reason. It started a chain reaction of events in Hungary that day that not only meant the drivers began falling out with each other in this dramatic sense, but also both halves of our own garage began to turn on each other. No one quite sure whether the engineers, the mechanics, the team on either side of the garage were actually somehow covertly in on this plan that each of their drivers had somehow put together on that day. I don't believe for a second that that was the case. This was led by the drivers, and the engineers and the mechanics then almost blindly followed them through that afternoon and on through the rest of the season, which was a mistake in itself. We as a team let ourselves down that year for a number of different reasons, but it all started in earnest on that particular day in the Hungarian Grand Prix in qualifying, when Lewis went rogue and then Fernando reacted in the most crazy, bizarre way. Certainly one of the most ridiculous pit stops I've ever been involved in my life, and you know, I'm sure we all remember it. I hope you enjoyed that little tale. Slightly different today, I guess. There are loads more where that came from, so I'm really enjoying these. They're great trips down memory lane for me. I'd love to know what you think, and I'd also love to know which other moments from history you'd like me to perhaps cover in another episode of Tales from the Treehouse. So give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you again very soon. Ta-ra.